The oblique abdominal muscles. How can they be trained? How do they contribute to movement? When discussing training the oblique abdominal muscles, people usually focus on the external oblique abdominal muscle and often overlook the internal oblique abdominal muscle. Although there are two of these muscles, let's start with the external oblique abdominal muscle. Its fibers run outward and inward, starting from the fifth rib and attaching at several points. The upper ribs down to the 12th rib, the iliac bone, and the aponeurosis of the rectus abdominis. In short, the direction of its fibers is outward. Let's examine the movement of the external oblique abdominal muscle in isolation. For instance, consider the left external oblique abdominal muscle. Here is the left external oblique abdominal muscle. When contracted in isolation, the left oblique muscle produces this movement. This results in a rotation to the right. In this process, the outer fibers of the muscle contract, causing the rotation. Beneath the external oblique abdominal muscle lies the internal oblique abdominal muscle, whose fibers run in the opposite direction. The fibers of the external oblique abdominal muscle follow this pattern, like this and this. The fibers of the internal oblique abdominal muscle follow the opposite pattern. On the outside, the movement produced by the isolated internal oblique abdominal muscle on the same left side results in a turn to the opposite side. When I turn to the right, the external oblique abdominal muscle on the left side is engaged. Here it is. And the internal oblique abdominal muscle on the right side is engaged as well. In other words, these muscles work together simultaneously, the external oblique and the internal oblique. During the turn, the external oblique muscle on one side contracts, while the internal oblique muscle on the opposite side stretches. This is what happens during a rotation. If both the external and internal oblique muscles on one side contract at the same time, a different type of movement occurs. For example, on the left side, both the external and internal oblique abdominal muscles contract simultaneously, producing this movement. Meanwhile, on the other side, the muscles are forced to relax, not entirely, but to a degree. Similar to how when the biceps work, the triceps must relax. They don't fully relax but remain under a certain level of tension. So, it turns out as that if you are going to train the external oblique abdominal muscle, specifically the external one, then you need exactly to perform twisting movements like this. This ensures that the external oblique abdominal muscle is engaged, while the internal oblique muscle remains inactive. Meanwhile, the internal oblique muscle is active. If you want to train both at the same time, you can perform movements like a side bend to the opposite side. There are many exercises available for targeting the oblique abdominal muscles. So, how do we strengthen these muscles? The truth is, there's no real problem with this. There are plenty of exercises to choose from, and they're all effective. You can pick any of them, as they all deliver results. But here's the key point about the oblique abdominal muscles. They must actively participate in movement. Proper movement during walking involves the sequential contraction of the external and internal oblique muscles. This is the movement, a sequential rotation to one side, then to the other, back and forth. This sequence ensures smooth, coordinated movement between the joints and vertebrae. If the oblique abdominal muscles aren't functioning properly, it's not just about their weakness, it's about the sequence of muscle activation. When this sequence is disrupted during walking, an incorrect movement pattern can occur. For example, instead of proper rotation, a side-to-side motion might emerge. This happens when both the external and internal oblique abdominal muscles contract simultaneously on one side, while on the other side, both muscles relax at the same time. Step by step, this incorrect pattern develops. What happens during this improper movement? During this step, this type of movement occurs. Both the external and internal oblique muscles on one side contract at the same time. This simultaneous contraction shouldn't happen during walking. With each step, I continue to make these incorrect movements. This results in the simultaneous contraction of both the external and internal oblique muscles on the left side. Meanwhile, on the right side, these muscles remain unused. As a result, the muscles on the right side gradually lose their tone. Because these muscles are not engaged, the ribs they are attached to, starting from the fifth rib, experience reduced movement. This lack of movement causes stiffness in the costovertebral joints, which connect the ribs to the vertebrae. At the connection between the vertebra and the rib lies the costovertebral joint. On the other hand, improper use of these muscles leads to shortening in this area. While there is still some movement in the joints, the muscles become shortened and overstrained, affecting both the external and internal oblique muscles. While there is movement in these joints, the shortened muscles themselves limit it. In proper movement during rotation to one side, the external oblique muscle contracts, while the internal oblique muscle stretches. When the external oblique contracts, the internal oblique stretches. This creates an alternating pattern of muscle, stretching and contracting. First, there is this alternating motion, stretching and contraction. Second, during rotation, the muscles begin to contract along their entire length, ensuring full engagement. During this rotation, the left inner thigh muscle stretches at that moment. And the outer thigh muscle on the right side stretches at the same moment. With the next step, the reverse occurs. As a result, the muscle engages along its entire length. This ensures the proper function of the muscle. If both the external and internal oblique muscles contract simultaneously, this proper full-length engagement doesn't occur, disrupting the muscle's natural function. With prolonged incorrect movement, such as walking without proper rotation for a long time, it becomes very difficult to regain proper movement patterns. For example, the individual may struggle to isolate movement in the chest or rib cage. Instead, the movement becomes rigid and unified, making it challenging to reintroduce proper rotation. To address this, several exercises can help stretch the oblique abdominal muscles and restore correct movement. Here's one such exercise that you can try. You can just do it. Begin by sitting down. This exercise can also serve as a test to identify which side has a shortened external oblique abdominal muscle. Sit on a stool in this position. Turn your torso toward the backrest until you can go no further, and use your hands for support. At this point, you should feel a slight stretch in the external oblique abdominal muscle. If the oblique abdominal muscle is shortened or significantly shortened, you can slightly lean back to intensify the stretch. Lean back again to intensify it further. That is, you will feel the stretch exactly in this position as you stretch it. In this position, you will effectively stretch the muscle. Stay in this position, taking slow breaths in and out. Hold for 15 to 20 seconds. In this position, you will specifically feel the stretch in the external oblique abdominal muscle. After about 10 seconds, as the sensation fades, slightly intensify the stretch by adding a small twist and leaning back a bit further. This exercise not only stretches the external oblique muscle, but also helps increase the range of motion for rotation, making it easier to perform proper movement during walking. In this position, you can simultaneously stretch the quadratus lumborum muscle, which is an antagonist to the oblique muscles. This occurs during these movements during the turns and also involves the lumbar region. With prolonged improper use of the oblique abdominal muscles, the lumbar region is also affected. With prolonged misuse of the oblique abdominal muscles, either the external oblique becomes shortened or the quadratus lumborum loses tone. It either becomes shortened or the quadratus lumborum muscle loses its tone. This method helps achieve freer movement during rotations. All other exercises to strengthen the oblique abdominal muscles will also be effective, but to start, it's important to focus on the basics. It can be difficult to independently determine where your oblique abdominal muscles are working or not, but you can get a general idea. You can simply feel your ribs, and you'll often find that on the side where the oblique abdominal muscles are weak, there may be little to no muscle covering the ribs, even though they should be. In contrast, the other side may feel more muscular. Try pressing on your abdominal area and compare the tone on both sides. Compare this area as well, the side with the muscles. Compare the right side with the left, focusing on the side with the weaker muscles. The muscles may not be completely absent. Often they are present but weak. Sometimes the weaker side might appear thick, but your hand will sink in when you press, indicating a lack of muscle tone. Often, a weak oblique abdominal muscle, such as on the right side, fails to function properly. As a result, when you observe yourself in the mirror, you may notice that you walk with an imbalance like this. When you observe yourself, you may notice that you walk like this. When you observe yourself in the mirror, you may notice that with a weak right oblique abdominal muscle, the position of the rib cage also changes. One side appears shortened, while the other is weak, resulting in a noticeable shift in position. If you identify a weakness in the oblique abdominal muscles, it's best to avoid starting with exercises that involve full-range movements targeting these muscles. Out of the many effective exercises, it's better to start with static exercises rather than dynamic ones. That is, start with a simple exercise for the oblique abdominal muscles, such as twisting or bending, but perform it statically rather than dynamically. It's better to begin with static exercises to help your inactive muscles start to engage and stabilize. On the weaker side, the muscles are often immobile and do not activate properly, so it's best to focus on two key steps. Start by training the weaker muscle statically, meaning without movement. This is the initial stage. After a couple of weeks, you can transition to dynamic exercises. However, the most important goal is to engage both the external and internal oblique muscles effectively. Above all, you must learn to perform proper torso rotation with every movement.